Welcome to Think Net Zero, where we explore how business strategy, climate finance, and innovation come together to thrive in the transition economy. This podcast series is presented by the University of Sydney's NetZero Institute. I'm your host, Niranjika, and I'm thrilled to have you with us as we begin a journey to unpack one of the biggest economic transformations of our time. Before we dive in, let us introduce who we are. NetZero Institute, a new cross-disciplinary hub dedicated to accelerating Australia's transitioning to a resilient, competitive net zero future. The Institute brings together researchers, industry, government, and innovators to explore how we decarbonize systems, unlock new technologies, and build an economy that thrives with planetary boundaries. So let's hear from Professor Diana D'Alessandro, the director of the NetZero Institute, on the mission of NZR.
Thanks, Nira. So the NetZero Institute is one of our flagship multidisciplinary research initiatives at the University of Sydney. We're about 180 colleagues, and we really do share the mission of coming in around practical decarbonisation solutions, which are ones that can help the world achieve its global climate goals of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It evolved from an earlier net zero initiative, and as I said, now is nearly 200 colleagues across the engineering faculty, science faculty, policy, health, computing, and we're all working in partnership with government, industries, and communities. So our mission here is really about developing the solutions, the technologies, the policies, but also the educational programs that we need to accelerate the transition and, of course, the adoption of these net zero solutions at scale. We have four major focus areas. So these are around reducing demand. So that means creating products and processes that consume less energy and produce fewer emissions. Our second research area is around zero emissions energy in industry. So this is about really optimizing renewable power and storage systems for low-cost energy. A third theme is around greenhouse gas removals, which is around technologies for carbon removals, such as direct air capture. And then a fourth major focus area around climate change risk, which is around assessing and mitigating risks to infrastructure and communities. So we've got a number of key projects, Nira, that really stretch across these different research focus areas. Okay.
Diana, that's the mission behind this podcast series as well, because the journey to net zero won't be driven by one sector alone. It requires new ways of thinking across finance, business, and innovation. And in each episode, we'll unpack how these forces shape the transition and how organizations can navigate, influence, and even lead it. To understand why net zero transition have become a business strategy, not just a sustainability add-on, we need to look at what has changed. Because only a few years ago, climate action existed on the periphery of organizations, somewhere between corporate social responsibility and community engagement. But today, climate alignment sits beside capital allocation, risk management, and long-term competitiveness. It's a strategic question, not a moral one. Let's start with a simple observation. Climate action and net zero planning are no longer sitting quietly in the sustainability department. They move directly into the center of business strategy. You can see it in annual reports, you can see it in investor calls, you can see it in the decisions organizations are making about capital, risk, growth, and competitiveness. In other words, climate action has become strategy, and the evidence is visible everywhere. Here, we're not talking about drivers yet. We're simply looking at what we can already observe in the market. Real shifts that show organizations are treating transition as a strategic opportunity. Transition plans have become strategic documents, not sustainability reports. The clearest sign that things have changed. Organizations are now expected to have a credible transition plan, and that plan is judged as part of their core strategy, not as a sustainability report, not as a marketing exercise, but as a blueprint that shows how the organization will stay profitable and competitive in a net zero economy. Investors, regulators, supply chain partners, and customers transition plans signals of future performance. A credible plan shows how the business will manage carbon risk, where it will invest, which technologies it will adopt, how it plans to fund the transition, and how
it will innovate to remain relevant. In other words, transition planning is no longer about environmental ambition. It's about economic survival and competitive positioning. A good example is Woodside. In 2024, Woodside subjected its climate transition plan to a shareholder vote, and the shareholders rejected it. Not because investors oppose climate action, quite the contrary. They rejected it because they felt the plan was not credible and not strategically aligned with where global energy markets are headed. That is a remarkable shift. A decade ago, climate plans weren't strategic enough to even vote on. Now, weak plans can lose the confidence of major shareholders. Another visible trend is internal reorganization. Organizations are restructuring around transition, changing leadership, and internal systems. We're seeing CFOs leading climate finance portfolios, chief strategy officers integrating transition scenarios, boards forming dedicated transition committees, CEOs naming decarbonization as one of their top strategic priorities, companies trying to execute bonuses to emissions and innovation milestones. And here's where we bring in a powerful example, Holcim. Holcim is one of the world's biggest cement producers, operates in one of the hardest to decarbonize sectors. But instead of fighting the transition, this restructured around it. They launched a new business division focused entirely on low-carbon business solutions, circular construction, and advanced materials. This future-ready division is now growing faster than their traditional businesses, so much so that it has become the company's primary long-term growth engine. In other words, Holcim is using the transition to redefine its competitive identity. This is what strategic repositioning looks like. Again, we can see companies are using net zero commitments to win customers and secure market share. Climate positioning is now a market differentiator. Across industries, customers, whether individuals or businesses, are choosing suppliers based on transition alignments. Retailers selecting how low-emission logistic partners, airlines choosing sustainable aviation fuel supplies, fashion brands demanding verified low-carbon materials, and big tech companies requiring renewable energy supply from data center partners. So this isn't just branding, it's procurement strategy. So when you win or lose contracts based on your transition pathway, climate action becomes a source of competitive advantage. Then we can see capital markets are rewarding credible transitions and penalizing weak action. This shift is especially clear in finance. Today, green bonds and sustainability-linked loans are routinely oversubscribed. Companies with credible transition plans receive lower financial costs. Investors are actively divesting from companies with weak transition pathways. Credit rating agencies incorporate transition risk into ratings. Entire investment funds are now built around transition themes. We have already seen companies lose market value, sometimes billions, after publishing transition strategies that investors judge as insufficient. Again, this is strategy at work. If transition affects your cost of capital, it affects your business future. Then we can also see leaders are using transition to open new innovation pathways and business models. The companies that are ahead of the curve aren't just reducing emissions. They're using the transition to create entirely new business models. Some of the examples may include IKEA scaling circular retail systems, Microsoft linking cloud strategy to renewable energy infrastructure, or Volvo committing an all-electric portfolio to capture future demand. These aren't peripheral ESG projects. These are future market shifts. Innovation is being reshaped by the transition, and companies want to be on the front foot. And finally, perhaps the most striking change we see is the boards are now treating transition as part of their fiduciary duty. Boards are being held accountable for transition planning. Investors are no longer shy about pushing back. We're seeing boards votes being lost, directors replaced, shareholders' resolutions demanding strong actions, pension funds openly criticizing companies without credible transition pathways. So when climate strategy affects board composition, it has become central to value creation. So what do we see clearly? Transition planning is shaping strategy. Companies are restructuring around it. Capital markets are responding to it. Customers are rewarding it. Boards are accountable for it. And the most forward-thinking companies are using it to innovate and reposition themselves for the next era of competition. Climate action has crossed a fundamental threshold. It's no longer peripheral, it's central, and it's strategic. So this is the shift. Climate action is no longer an external agenda. It has become one of the defining strategic questions for modern organizations. Transition plans are scrutinized. Capital follows credible pathways, and competitiveness now depends on how well organizations navigate the net zero economy. Now that we understand why climate action is strategic, let's dive into the forces shaping this new reality. We can actually identify 6 forces that explain why transition plans are not a communications exercise, but a competitive mandate. The most obvious force is the policy context. So we can see Paris Agreement commitments turning into real policies now. For years, global-level climate agreements, such as Paris Agreement and the annual COP pledges, were treated as soft signals, political commitment, ambitions. But today, these commitments are being translated into concrete domestic policies in the shape of renewable energy mandates, clean industry incentives, carbon border taxes, new reporting obligations, and regulated sector-specific transition pathways. Countries aren't just promising to decarbonize, they're rebuilding their economic policy around these goals. These are taking place across all the regions. The EU now ties trade access to climate performance. Asia-Pacific countries are building national transition plans linked to Paris targets. For example, Australia has a mandatory reporting requirements now. This means organizations must align or they risk losing market access. This is not politics. This is competitiveness. So the second force we can see is investor pressure and market expectations. Markets have shifted permanently. Now investors are demanding credible decarbonization plans, short-term milestones, transparent emissions data, financial modeling under climate scenarios, capex alignment with transition pathways. 2050 net zero pledge isn't just enough. Investors want to see the next 3 to 5 years, not just 2050. This is why climate plans are now treated like business strategies. If a company cannot adapt to a decarbonization economy, it becomes a risky investment. And that risk influences valuation, cost of capital, insurance, and long-term shareholder confidence. So let's move into the third force, rapid technology shifts. Now, clean technologies are accelerating faster than traditional industries can keep up. So we're witnessing renewable energy becoming the cheapest power source in most regions. Battery prices are falling dramatically. Electric transport penetrating markets faster than predicted. Green hydrogen entering industrial production, and AI optimizing energy, logistics, and resource use. Technology is pushing emissions down and simultaneously brings the cost down. Companies that move early gain massive efficiency and innovation advantages. Companies that delay risk being stuck with outdated, expensive legacy systems. This is why innovation and climate action are merging into a single strategic agenda. So the next force we see is the change in the consumer and the workforce expectations. Consumers increasingly demand low carbon product, transparency in the supply chains, circular design, and ethical productions. And the workforce is just as vocal, especially the younger talent. Many won't work for organizations that lack credible climate strategies. This affects quality of the recruitment, retention, brand value, and ultimately the social license to operate. Soft pressure becomes strategic pressure. Then another force we see is the geopolitics and the global clean industry race. We're living through a new industrial revolution. The clean industrial revolution. Countries are becoming to lead in batteries, critical minerals, renewable manufacturing, green steel, low-carbon materials, hydrogen, and future energy exports. So look at the scale of some of these policies. For instance, the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan, Japan and Korea's Industrial Transition Frameworks, major clean energy export strategies in traditional fossil fuel-dependent countries such as Australia and Middle East. Climate policy is now attached to economic policy. Economic policy is now the geopolitical power. If organizations don't align with the transition, the whole nation can fall behind very, very fast. And finally, we see climate impacts are no longer projections. We can physically experience them. You can see the increase in heat waves, bushfires, floods, cyclone damage, and disrupted supply chains. Both now start asking these questions. What are exposed to risk? What is the cost of inaction? How resilient are our assets? What adaptation strategies are in place? So resilience is no longer optional. It's a financial imperative with the change in climate impacts. So when we combine these 6 forces together, the global policy alignment, investor pressure, technological disruption, shift in consumer expectations, geopolitical competition, and physical climate exposure, the conclusion becomes very clear. Transition planning is strategic planning. Companies that recognize this will lead. Companies that ignore it will lose the competitiveness. Climate action is no longer charity, it's not philanthropy, it's not just a PR exercise. It's the most important strategic shift of the next decade. Now that we have established why climate action is strategic action and why the 6 forces of the transition economy makes this unavoidable, the next question is, how do organizations actually fund this transition? Because let's be pragmatic, every meaningful climate action requires capital. Decarbonization energy requires capital. Building efficient operations requires capital. Redesigning supply chains requires capital. Scaling innovation requires capital. Reskilling the workforce requires capital. So you can have the best transition plan in the world, but if you don't have the capital to execute it, then it's just a document, not a strategy. That's where climate finance comes in. And climate finance is not a new category of philanthropy. It's not a feel-good funding category. It's not corporate donation bucket. Climate finance is emerging as the primary mechanism for enabling competitiveness in this transition economy. Let's try to break this down. First, climate finance has become a mainstream financial category. If you compare where we are today to where global finance was even 5 years ago, the difference is enormous. Green bonds, sustainability-linked loans, transition finance instruments. These used to be niche products aimed at corporate responsibility teams. But in the last 2 years, they have exploded. The world crossed $1 trillion in annual sustainable finance flows. Investment into transition technologies hit $2. And emerging markets alone saw a double-digit increase in green bond issuance. So this tells us something real important. Climate finance is no longer a special category. It's becoming a core allocation class across global markets. Banks issue sustainability-linked loans because the risk profile is clearer. Investors buy green infrastructure assets because returns are stable. Sovereign wealth funds invest in clean energy because it's geopolitically strategic. Export credit agencies finance transition projects because trade rules are changing. In short, capital follows transition because the transition is where the growth is happening. Second, this is perhaps the most powerful strategic shift. Not only the climate finance is expanding, it is altering the fundamental economics of business transformation. Today, companies with credible transition plan can access low-cost capital. Lenders are offering better terms if emission targets are met. Investors are using climate alignment as a screening tool. Banks are pricing climate risk directly into loan. It can also be grants. So climate finance isn't just money to do good. It influences interest rates, refinancing costs, access to debt markets, and capital structure. In a world where the transition economy defines future competitiveness. In a world where the transition economy defines future competitiveness, your climate plan literally affects your cost of money. This is why the Woodside example matters so much. The climate plan wasn't just rejected because it was just environmentally weak. It was rejected because it was strategically weak as well. And investors refused to finance a plan that didn't align with transition pathways. Capital is becoming conditional. If your strategy aligns with the net zero world, you access capital very cheaply. Even the climate finance can be a grant. If it doesn't, capital becomes expensive or disappears altogether. This is a fundamental rewrite of economic logic. Then, climate finance turns innovation from optional to essential. So let's talk about innovation here. Every organization talks about innovation. Every CEO says they want innovation. Every annual report highlights it. But innovation requires one thing: investment. And until recently, many organizations underinvested in climate innovation because it didn't sit inside the business case. But climate finance changes that equation. Today, companies are using climate finance to fund hydrogen pilots, electrify heavy transport fleets, scale digital optimization for energy and operations, develop low-carbon materials, invest in circular manufacturing, build nature-positive supply chains. Climate finance unlocks these innovations by offering funding mechanisms tied to future competitiveness, not legacy accounting. Innovation is no longer a side experiment. It becomes core capability building. Then, a big challenge organizations face is that climate transition is a multi-year, sometimes multi-decade shift. So climate finance supports long-term transformation, not short-term gestures. You can't electrify an entire fleet in 1 year, switch chemicals or minerals overnight, or build a renewable power procurement in a single quarter. Climate finance solves by enabling structured, staged capital planning. Organizations use climate finance to build transition roadmaps, spread investment over time, integrate climate pathways into CapEx cycles, and reduce disruption to business operations. So this is really important because without climate finance, climate action becomes a year-by-year negotiation inside the organization. With climate finance, climate action becomes a long-term investment program, just like digital transformation, infrastructure renewable, or international expansion. It becomes strategy. Planned, not reactive. Climate finance makes climate action measurable, auditable, and accountable. This is when climate action is funded through structured instruments, loans, blended finance, government incentives. Something powerful happens. Climate action becomes visible. It becomes quantifiable. It becomes trackable. It becomes tied to KPI and performance metrics. Investors don't just ask, are you decarbonizing? They ask, what are your milestones? What are your emissions year on year? How much CapEx is aligned with your transition plan? How are you performing against your climate-linked loan incentives? This accountability raises the quality and ambition of transition plans. Climate finance, in other words, enforces strategy discipline. And for policymakers, climate finance is the way to scale national competitiveness. Let's zoom out. For governments, climate finance is not about doing good for the planet. It's about energy security, trade competitiveness, industrial capability, workforce development, and long-term economic growth. If climate action is positioned as charity, it will always be underfunded. But when climate action is positioned as a national competitive strategy, government invests at scale. Climate finance is how nations compete in the transition economies. It's how countries rebuild industrial bases, attract capital, secure supply chains, and strengthen geopolitical resilience. And this core message is clear. Climate action is not a moral project. It's an economic strategy. Climate finance is the engine that makes that strategy possible. For organizations, this means moving climate out of the corner office and into the core business plan. For policymakers, it means designing economic incentives, not donations. For investors, it means backing transition leaders, not laggards. Climate finance is how we turn ambition into capability and capability into competitive advantage. As we wrap up this episode, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Because everything we have discussed today points to one simple idea. Climate action is no longer a side project. It is no longer an ESG task. It is no longer a moral nice to have. It is strategy. And not just strategy in the abstract sense, but strategy in the practical, competitive, economic sense that businesses, investors, and governments understand. We're living through a structural shift in how value is created. Markets are changing, technologies are changing, capital flows are changing, and expectations from regulators, shareholders, consumers, and workers are changing. This is what we call the transition economy, and economy being rewired in real time. Across this episode, we frame the transition through three big ideas. First, net zero is a strategic action, not a compliance task. Businesses with credible transition plans are attracting more investments, gaining better financial terms, securing their supply chains, reducing long-term risk, and positioning themselves for the growth markets of the future. Businesses without those plans, they'll lose in investor confidence, facing regulatory pressure and becoming less competitive each year. We have already seen this play out in shareholder votes, in capital markets, in energy investment trends, and in international trade rules. The market is no longer rewarding good intentions. It's rewarding credible actions. The second one is the transition economy is driven by 6 forces, and together they form a new competitive landscape. Policy and climate agreements at global level, capital reallocations, technology breakthroughs, consumer and workforce expectations, physical climate risk, geopolitics and supply chains. These aren't just distant forces. There are active pressures shaping the decisions organizations must make today. And when all 6 move at once, the result is a level of disruption and opportunity that defines the playing field. This is why treating climate as a strategic domain isn't optional. It's an essential for long-term competitiveness. Third, climate finance is the engine that turns strategy into reality. Ambition doesn't decarbonize anything. Capital does. Climate finance, whether it's green bonds, blended finance, public-private partnerships, or sustainability-linked loans, gives organizations the ability to invest in transformation. Clean energy, low-carbon materials, electrified operations, circular systems, innovation pipelines, workforce transitions, and large-scale infrastructure. This isn't charity, this isn't philanthropy, this is investment in productivity, resilience, and economic advantage. Policymakers, the lesson is very clear. If you want the transition to scale, you must frame it as an economic development, not environmental stewardship. So where does this leave us? It leaves us as a pivotal point, a turning point in economic history. The organizations or countries that thrive over the next 30 years will be the ones that understand this shift and act accordingly. Those who see the climate action not as a burden but as a platform innovation, investment, competitiveness, and long-term value creation. The transition economy isn't coming, it's here. And the question now is, should we move? And how fast and how well? Because in every major transition, from the Industrial Revolution to the digital age, the leaders weren't the ones who waited. They were the ones who recognized the signals early, aligned their strategy, mobilized capital, and built the future before everyone else. That's the opportunity businesses have today, and that's the opportunity countries have national level right now. Thank you for joining us in this first episode of Think Net Zero. In the episodes ahead, we'll go deeper into tools, technology, the finance mechanism, and the strategic decisions that will shape the next decade of transition. But for now, remember, climate action is no longer an external pressure. It's the next frontier of competitiveness, and it's where you create value. Thank you.